I think maybe just some perspective on what I see happening. Steve, in his talk, he talked about these principles that almost become like the water that we swim in. It becomes invisible. And I think what's happening now in 2020, and especially with COVID-19, is there are some really deep-seated unconscious beliefs. I like to think of them as narratives or stories. Some of these invisible water principles that's being challenged now. And primarily, I think the ones that we're grappling with is the idea that stability and certainty and things being controllable and predictable, that is normal. And when we have these periods of instability and uncertainty, as we're seeing now with the pandemic, that those are abnormal and temporary, and therefore they will go away. And you can hear it in the language. We keep talking about when are we going back to normal, or what is the new normal? And I believe that normal is a code word for certainty and stability. And what we're starting to realize is that these last few decades that we've been in was kind of a period of almost abnormal stability. And that what we're facing now, or we're kind of being reminded now that uncertainty, instability, those are normal, and we need to make peace with perpetual uncertainty. And this is not something that human beings find easy. So in my work, many, especially leaders and decision makers that I work with, they are finding this exceptionally difficult. It feels like all of the solid ground has been removed under our feet. We are in uncharted territory. We basically feel as if we've lost our moorings, we've lost our bearings. And one of the reasons for this, I believe, is that things that made us successful up to now are no longer sufficient for us. It's like we're continuously on this boundary between competence and incompetence, between knowing and not knowing. And if, like most of us, we grew up in a schooling system and we have worked in an organization where the dominant narratives around what makes a good leader are things like knowing where you're going, having answers, being able to provide certainty for others, then now being in this place where you can't have answers, where you can't know, is actually quite anxiety provoking. It is not something that comes naturally to human beings. And I really love this quote by a friend of mine who basically said that those who will thrive in future, and this is individuals as well as organizations, are the ones who can turn this anxiety into creative energy. We can't avoid the anxiety. We can't wish it away. I think in some of my clients, the people that I work with, the defense mechanisms that they are deploying against this anxiety is essentially working against everything that they're trying to achieve in their organizations. For some, they're completely unable to make decisions. They just become paralyzed by the uncertainty. Others just try and keep busy all the time. They are, some of them have such unrealistic expectations now of their staff and of themselves that they have almost epidemics of burnout in some of these organizations. Others refuse to to prioritize. They kind of want to hedge their bets and try and do everything instead of focusing on one or two things. And so this idea of turning anxiety into creative energy, I think is really key. And that is something that I want to spend, a little bit of time with you this afternoon. And I think where it starts is understanding that we are not living in a world where we're only dealing with one kind of system. Steve already introduced you to the idea of seeing an organization as a machine, whereas it's actually more of a complex organism, or I would rather say maybe an ecosystem. And it's these two different kinds of systems that we kind of find ourselves always with one foot in the one and the other foot in the other one. And in my language, these would be complicated systems where things are ordered and predictable, where we can do analysis, we can look at the parts, optimize the parts, put it back together again, like a machine. I can fully understand the system. It doesn't have any emergent properties. It doesn't just suddenly start acting in ways that I cannot explain by looking at the parts. If you look at the other system, though, this I would term a complex adaptive system. it's like it's an ecosystem. Things are connected in ways that I cannot fully understand. Something that happens in one part of the system has a completely unexpected impact on something in a completely different part of the system. And it's unpredictable. I'm dealing with known or unknown unknowns, whereas in a more mechanical universe, I'm dealing with known unknowns or even known knowns. And I think part of the problem is that many of our organizational, best practices, the methods we choose, even in the agile community, we've kind of assumed that we are in this world of order, where we can almost have recipes that we can apply and that will work universally. And I think what we're starting to see now is that we are in unique, complex systems where something that works even in another bank in the same country will not necessarily work in your system. So we need to find ways to create fit for context, solutions and patterns, and not just copy what other people are doing. And so it's really important for us to understand where this complexity comes from. And, I like to go back to the meaning of the word complex. If you look at that word plex, it means woven together, or I quite like the idea of tangled together. And so these complex systems are entangled, they're messy. And complexity comes from the rich connections between things. So going back to my analogy of the car, when the gear lever and the clutch connect to each other, or, two different parts in the car, they remain the same. They connect in a way that provides functionality, but they don't adapt because they are now connected. In a human system, it's very different. The moment we form connections with others, the moment we start interacting with our environment, those connections are rich. And immediately we are changed by our interactions. And so this is a continuously evolving system. It is adapting to the agents within it, but it's also always adapting to its environment. So it's never static. And what's really important for us to understand is that the more connected we become, the more complex things become, and the more complex they become, the more uncertain. Because many of these connections are invisible. We're not even aware that they're there. And we saw this now with COVID-19 and how the virus spread around the world, even with idea viruses, if you want to call them that. The way that they spread, the way that people form tribes based on how they, shared beliefs. There's almost no way to predict how things are connected now. And so another thing that I want to say before I scare you completely with this idea of complexity is that it's not new. It cannot be wished away. It cannot be tamed. It cannot be simplified. And it's not good or bad. It just is. I find it interesting. I've been working in this field now for almost 20 years. And in the past, you didn't see the word complexity very often in standard business literature like the Harvard Business Review, for example. The last 4 or 5 years, you started seeing more of it, but most often they talk about helping us tame complexity or simplifying complexity. And, I find that quite ironic. You'll see that many of the large consulting companies are also now starting to adopt the language, but most of them are trying to eliminate complexity. And that simply cannot be done. In a conversation this morning, we spoke about our organizations sometimes being overcomplicated. We've got unnecessary complications in some of the bureaucracy and the processes that we definitely can and should simplify. But complexity in the sense of being part of a complex, interconnected human system, we simply need to navigate it. And the good news is we already know how. So if you've ever been in traffic, if you've ever been part of a social group or an extended family and you had to navigate those dynamics, if you've ever used public transport, if you've ever been in a city and you had to navigate city sidewalks, you have been in a complex system. And hopefully what you'll realize after today is that your organization is also a complex adaptive system. It is continuously changing and adapting. And one of the problems, though, we know complexity, we've navigated it, but we have outsourced our relationship with uncertainty to certainty merchants. I just love this quote by Diego Espinosa, and you could see it everywhere. So I'm using an image there of weather I studied meteorology, so that's kind of going back to my roots. But what we see is that we don't even want to have this relationship with uncertain weather. We want somebody to tell us exactly what is going to happen. Entire industries like the life insurance industry, or even retirement or investment industries, have grown up to be certainty merchants for others. And sometimes I think leaders and change managers and people in organizations fall into the trap of wanting to be certainty merchants for others. And people will very readily accept that, because it's much easier if somebody can tell you what to do than to actually have your own relationship with uncertainty. And I think this is what complexity is calling us to do, is to reacquaint ourselves with uncertainty. But the problem, and I'm a bit of a blogger, and this particular image was created for me based on one of my blog posts by a cartoonist friend of mine. And I think it kind of speaks for itself. It really is hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo. Sometimes I adapt this to say it's hard to respond to a jungle if you are structured like a zoo. And I think many of us, we need to take responsibility for creating these zoo-like environments that are safe and very ordered and predictable and structured, but they're not very adaptive. And what's happening now is that those really, very routine, ordered spaces in our organizations are being automated, and humans, people need to start, operating, checking back in with their humanity and their creativity and functioning in these unordered, unpredictable, uncertain spaces where they can explore and be creative. But if we've been taught in a zoo, it's very, very difficult to kind of break out of that zoo mentality. So I want to, before I end off, introduce you to 3 habits of mind that I think will be useful for you to help reacquaint yourself with uncertainty, and also to be able to practice this 21st century management that Steve spoke about in the first talk. So the first of this is you need to cultivate curiosity and openness. I think we have fallen into a way of being where we are very certain of what we know, certain that we are right, certain that we have answers, instead of being curious and valuing questions more than we value answers. And if you think, for example, how we are treated when we are in school, it's the ones who have the answers that get the praise, that gets rewarded, not the ones with the questions. And we need to shift this, because answers, if you think of complex systems as continuously changing, something that is an answer today may not be an answer tomorrow. So questions are more valuable to us in complexity. And that discomfort of not knowing, I think the other thing that we tend to do is we identify a problem very, very quickly, and then we jump to solution. Instead of just sitting in that discomfort of not knowing what's going on, sitting in the confusion, really trying to understand what we're dealing with before we decide we know what the problem is. We also need to be open to diverse perspectives. If we all think in the same way and the context around us shifts, then we're all kind of going to have a Kodak moment together. So how do we really embrace diversity? I think we don't need to frame it as a problem to solve, as many organizations are doing with diversity and inclusion processes. We need to see it as a strategic asset to nurture, because this is where our innovations are going to come from. And then also we need to embrace serendipity and surprise. Most innovation actually happens by accident. People who run into each other and have conversations they didn't expect to have, and new ideas emerge from there. So how do we design organizations where these things are more likely to occur? Then the second one is we need to embrace messiness, and this is very difficult. Especially that first one. Efficiency is not always your friend, and we have had such a strong focus on efficiency in our organizations over the last few years. In many organizations, we've got zero slack. We tell people that we want them to learn, but there's no time for them to learn because many people are already overstretched. So how do we reintroduce some slack into our system, some requisite inefficiency, so that we can become more effective? We also need to let go of a need for agreement and consensus. In complexity, we're dealing with paradox. We're dealing with multiple things that's true at the same time. And if we force people to come to agreement, very often what we're doing again is we're forcing similarity into a system where actually we need the diversity to be resilient. So how can we create a coherent diversity? So we're all recognizable, but there are differences. We're running safe to fail experiments to see what will work rather than try and come up with a one right answer. And then we need to also remember that we're dealing with patterns that arise from, they emerge almost from interactions within the system. They are dynamic, they're entangled. They are not problems that can be solved with things like root cause analyses. These linear problem solving techniques, they work really well when we're in an ordered context. But in a complex context, they actually get us in trouble because we focus too soon and we focus too narrowly. So how do we start seeing patterns that we can influence, not necessarily problems that we need to solve? And then lastly, and this one is also quite contentious, is we need to learn to discern time and timing. And my friend Alicia Juarero, she introduced me, or she reminded me again of the two kinds of time. So there's linear chronological time. We talk about chronos time. That is the time that we live in every day, the time that unfolds kind of linearly as we grow older, as we go through life. And this is the time that we try to speed up in when we are going through agile processes, for example. When you look at team velocity and you try and go faster, you're speeding up in chronos time. But there's a second kind of time named kairos, which is the opportune time. It is when time and context come together and the time is just right for something to shift, for an opportunity to become real. And sometimes when we try and speed up in chronos time, we miss those kairos moments when we could have actually made quite a big impact, or we could have leveraged an opportunity. And so there are just three aspects here, and then I'm going to close with my next slide. One is there's a time to act and a time to wait. Sometimes we introduce change and it's almost like we're sowing seeds and we never actually allow time for those seedlings to sprout and to bear fruit. So sometimes we need to know when to act and when to wait. Then there's a time to go fast and a time to go slow. We need to slow down, take a step back and get a balcony view and see, kind of get out of the frenetic everyday work so that we can reflect, get a view of the patterns and really think about what it is that we're doing. And then there's a time to keep going and a time to let go. And this is very difficult because sometimes we invest a lot of money and time into big projects. When the context shifts, they're no longer relevant, but then they've become too big to fail. And in complexity, we cannot allow that. It will kill us very often if we're not able to make a necessary ending. And so this idea of understanding that we're in a flow of time is really, really important. And then I want to close with this slide. It is one of my favorite poems, and I think Antonio Machado can, the way that he articulates this is just so much better than I can. And what I love is, traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking. There is no path, only trails across the sea. So we are all exploring together. We're all pioneering together. And thank you so much for this opportunity to spend this time with you and share some of these ideas.